using visa sanctions with countries like Pakistan to ensure they accept back eligible perpetrators.
Home Secretary Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let us start by remembering the victims of this scandal. Thousands of young girls, often in their early teens, were systematically raped by gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Those in positions of authority, the police, local councils, the CPS, ignored them, and in some cases even covered up these horrendous crimes because of absurd concerns about so-called cultural sensitivity. 10 days ago, the Prime Minister compounded this by saying it was a far-right bandwagon to raise these issues and call for a proper inquiry. Let me say this, it is not far-right to stand up for rape victims, and smearing those who raise this issue is exactly what led to the victims.
Order, order. The Shadow Home Secretary will be heard. Shadow Secretary.
Smearing those who raise this is exactly what led to the victims being ignored and the crimes covered up in the first place. So will the Home Secretary apologise on behalf of the Prime Minister for his language last week? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not true to say that the previous government did nothing following the ICSA report. The last government set up the Grooming Gang Task Force following the ICSA report, which led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year alone, and I'm glad the new government is continuing that work. In April 2023, the data collection on the ethnicity of perpetrators was initiated, but the initial publication of that, I think last November, showed the collection is incomplete. So will the Home Secretary ensure the police follow through on the work initiated in April 2023 and ensure the data is collected more comprehensively? And the mandatory reporting recommendation was introduced as an amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell due to the early election. And I'm glad the government say they will now pick that up and take it forwards. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, previous reports and reviews did not go far enough. The ICSA report itself was mainly not about these rape gangs. In fact, it barely touched on the issue and only looked at 6 towns. We now believe as many as 50 towns could have been affected, so ICSA barely scratched the surface. Now, the Home Secretary just announced government support for only 5 local inquiries. Let me say this is wholly inadequate when we know up to 50 towns are affected. So I have some serious questions for the Home Secretary. Firstly, how are the other 40+ towns supposed to get answers to the questions that they have? And these initial 5 towns, how will they be chosen? And secondly, the Home Secretary said nothing in her statement about the powers these local inquiries will have. It seems they will not be statutory inquiries under the 2005 Act. That means these local inquiries will not have the power to compel witnesses to attend or to take evidence under oath or to requisition written evidence. So if that's the case, how can they possibly get to the truth when faced with cover-ups? In fact, it was precisely that problem, the lack of powers, that led the chairs of the Manchester local inquiry to reportedly resign last year because they weren't given the information they needed by public authorities and they didn't have the powers required to force its release, and so they resigned. These powers are needed, the legal powers, because these crimes were deliberately covered up in some cases. We heard just a week or two ago from the former Labour MP for Rochdale, Simon Danchuk, who said that the then chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party told him not to raise these issues for fear of losing Muslim votes. Truly appalling. Now, not a single person has been convicted for covering up or ignoring these crimes. In my view, the criminal vile perpetrators who can be deported should be, every single one of them, changing the law if needed to do it and using visa sanctions with countries like Pakistan to ensure they accept back eligible perpetrators. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Home Secretary has announced today is totally inadequate. It will only cover a fraction of the towns affected, and it appears these inquiries will not have the legal powers they need. That is why we need a proper, full, national public inquiry covering the whole country and with the powers under the Inquiry Act needed to obtain the evidence required. And it's not just me that thinks that. In the last week or two, the Labour MPs for Rotherham and Liverpool Walton have called for a full national inquiry, as has Andy Burnham, the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester. And I commend those members and Andy Burnham for their courage in speaking out. Recent polling shows the vast majority of the public want a full national public inquiry, including 73% of Labour voters. But most importantly and finally, so do victims. Jane was groomed and abused at the age of just 12. She was gang raped repeatedly. She told the police and she told her social worker. At one point, the police even found her being abused by an illegal immigrant. But instead of arresting him, the police arrested her. Jane still doesn't know if any of her abusers have been jailed or if any of the public officials who let her down so badly have been held to account. Jane now wants a proper national public inquiry. Home Secretary, why don't you?